In the summer of 674, the largest fleet ever assembled sailed toward Constantinople. Arab commanders stood on their decks and looked at the city walls. They had already conquered Egypt, Persia, Syria, North Africa, Jerusalem. They had swept across half the known world in 40 years. Nobody had stopped them. Nobody had even slowed them down. Constantinople was next. The Byzantine emperor looked out from the walls and knew what he was seeing. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, an empire that had been winning every fight for 4 decades. His own army was exhausted. His treasury was nearly empty. His generals were telling him the same thing. We cannot match them, ship for ship, sword for sword, man for man. They were right. But the emperor had something nobody else had, and in a few days, the Arab commanders were going to find out what it was. They would never forget it. To understand what happened in that harbor, you need to understand what the world looked like before Greek fire existed. Because the weapon didn't just save Constantinople once, it saved it 5 times. And every single time, the people who could have benefited from it earlier had spent years arguing that using it was wrong. That's the part almost nobody talks about. The Byzantine Empire in the 7th century was not doing well. 100 years earlier, it had been the most powerful state in Europe and the Middle East. It controlled everything around the Mediterranean. Its army was professional, disciplined, feared. Its capital city, Constantinople, sat at the crossing point between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Constantinople controlled trade routes worth more than most kingdoms. But by 670, the empire had been through decades of war. First with Persia, which nearly destroyed both of them. Then the Arab Caliphate had risen out of Arabia and hit both exhausted empires at the same time. Persia collapsed completely. Byzantium lost Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. In 30 years, the empire had shrunk by half. The Arab commanders looked at this and drew an obvious conclusion. Finish the job. Take Constantinople. That city was the whole game. Whoever held it held the crossing between continents, and if the Caliphate took it, there was nothing standing between their armies and the rest of Europe. Not really. So in 674 they came. The Arab fleet was huge. Arab land forces marched up the peninsula toward the city walls on the other side. The plan was simple: besiege the city from both sea and land, cut off its supply lines, and wait. The walls of Constantinople were the strongest in the world. Nobody was going to break them directly, but nobody could hold a city forever without food and resupply. The Byzantines knew this plan. They had seen it before. The question was not whether the Arabs had good strategy. They did. The question was whether the Byzantines had something the Arabs hadn't counted on. They had one thing. His name, according to the sources, was Kallinikos, a Greek-speaking engineer from the city of Heliopolis in what is now Syria, which had recently been conquered by the Arabs. He came to Constantinople sometime around 670 with something he had been working on for years: a weapon. More specifically, a liquid. A liquid that burned. Not just burned on water, burned when you threw water on it, stuck to ships, to wood, to skin, burned and kept burning, could not be put out. Callinicos called it something like ___0__. Later, people would call it Greek fire. He brought his formula to the Byzantine emperor. The emperor understood immediately what he was looking at. Not everyone agreed. The man who argued hardest against it was a general named Nikephoros. Not a fool, actually a good commander, experienced, decorated. He had spent his career fighting the right way, organized formations, disciplined cavalry, infantry that held its ground. He understood war as a contest between trained men, skill against skill, courage against courage. He had rules about how war was supposed to work, and those rules had a reason. They kept it from becoming pure slaughter. Nikephoros looked at what Callinicos was proposing and said something that, at the time, probably sounded reasonable. Quote 1, he told the emperor. Quote 2. The emperor heard him out. Then the emperor said, Nikephoros told him. Nikephoros was honest. He said they would lose. Nikephoros did not like it. But he was a soldier, and the emperor had spoken. He would follow orders. What he wouldn't do was command the fire ships himself. That job, he made clear, was beneath him. He would regret that decision, not because of what it cost him personally, but because of what it cost him the chance to understand. The weapon itself was remarkable, not just because it burned, but because of how it was delivered. Callinicos hadn't just invented a flammable liquid. He had invented a system. Bronze tubes mounted on the prows of ships, bellows or some kind of pump mechanism behind them. The liquid was heated, pressurized, and then shot out in a stream, like a hose, but a hose that sprayed fire. Nobody had seen anything like it. The mechanics of exactly how it worked are still debated. The precise formula is genuinely lost. We'll get to that. But what we know is that it was projected, not just thrown. It didn't just splash onto an enemy ship. It came out under pressure, in a directed stream, and it ignited on contact. And it burned on water. That part is key, because the natural response when something on your ship catches fire is to throw water on it. That didn't work with Greek fire. If anything, some accounts suggest water made it spread. The composition was kept so secret that even within Byzantium, almost nobody knew all of it. The formula was held by the emperor personally. The engineers who worked with it knew parts. Nobody knew all of it. This was by design. The weapon was only useful as long as nobody else had it, which meant it had to stay secret. And that meant the first time they used it, the Arabs had absolutely no idea what was coming. 674. The Arab fleet approaches the entrance to the harbour. Byzantine fire ships move out to meet them. The Arab commanders would have watched this and been puzzled. Byzantine ships moving to engage? Fine. That's expected. They had more ships, more men. This was not a fight they feared. Then the bronze tubes on the prow of the leading Byzantine vessel turned toward the nearest Arab ship. Then something came out of them. The accounts from Arab sources about this moment are striking because they are so clearly written by men trying to describe something they had never seen and had no words for. They talk about fire that flew through the air, fire that sat on the water, fire that could not be drowned. Several sources call it, quote, 6. One account describes Arab sailors jumping into the sea to escape the flames on their ships, and then the fire following them, because it floated on water, because it stuck to things, including people. The Arab fleet did not win that engagement. They came back the following year, and the year after. Each time, the Greek fire was waiting. For 4 years, the Arab fleet tried to establish a permanent base close enough to blockade Constantinople, and each time the fire ships pushed them back. By 678, the Arab commander made a decision that tells you everything you need to know about how the campaign had gone. He called off the siege and sailed home. The most powerful military force on earth had spent 4 years trying to take one city and had failed. Back in Constantinople, people celebrated. The emperor credited the fire. Kallinikos was honored, and Nikephoros, the general who had called it dishonorable, said nothing publicly about his earlier objections. But privately, he held his position. Real warriors didn't need tricks, he still believed. The fire had worked this time, but it was a crutch. It made men soft. If they relied on the fire, what happened when the enemy figured out how to counter it? Then they'd have an army that had forgotten how to fight. He wasn't the last person to make this argument. And for the next 40 years, it would simmer in the background. The quiet disagreement between those who thought the fire was salvation and those who thought it was a shortcut that would eventually cost them. Both sides were about to find out who was right. 717, 40 years after the first siege. The Arab Caliphate had not forgotten Constantinople. If anything, 40 years had made them more determined. They had spent the intervening decades consolidating, expanding in other directions, building up their fleet, and studying what had gone wrong. They had a new general, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, the brother of the Caliph himself. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a test. This was the full force of the Caliphate, organized and aimed at one target. The fleet they assembled was larger than the one from 674. Estimates from the period vary, but the numbers are staggering. Some sources say 1,800 ships. Some say more. Land forces came from multiple directions at once. The plan was the same as before, land and sea siege, but bigger, better organized, with more resources. The Byzantine Empire in 717 was in rough shape. There had been political chaos, emperors rising and falling, resources depleted. The new emperor, Leo III, had been on the throne for less than a year. He was still consolidating power. He had enemies inside the empire as well as outside. Maslama looked at all of this and saw a city that was finally ready to fall. He wasn't wrong about the balance of forces. On paper, the Byzantines couldn't win this fight, not through conventional means, not man for man, ship for ship. Leo knew this. His advisors knew this. Even the officers who still muttered about honorable warfare knew this. There was a general in Leo's council. Let's call him by the title the sources give him, Strategos of the Aegean, who had built his career on the old model. He was not a bad man. He was a competent commander, decorated, respected. But he had spent 30 years fighting in the ways soldiers had always fought, and he had a deep suspicion of the fire. "It is a terror weapon," he told the Emperor's council. He paused. Leo looked at him for a long moment. The strategist calculated. He was honest. A pause. The strategist said nothing. Leo turned back to his other advisers. The strategist sat back. He didn't argue further. He had made his case. The Emperor had decided. That was how it worked. But he made one request. He would not command the fireships. He would take a unit of conventional warships and cavalry to deal with any Arab forces that made it to shore. That, at least, was warfare he understood. Leo agreed. He had bigger things to think about. Because the Arab fleet was already in the Sea of Marmara. They were days away. And this time, there was a detail nobody had fully anticipated. A detail that was going to change the battle completely, but not in the way anyone expected. The Arab commanders had done their homework. They knew about Greek fire. 40 years of study, and they had learned that the weapon burned on water, couldn't be extinguished normally, and was delivered from the prows of Byzantine ships. They had a counter-strategy. Simple, direct, stay out of range, and when the fire ships come forward, surround them with conventional ships and board them before they can fire. Take the weapon out of the equation through numbers and close quarters. On paper, it was a reasonable plan. But Maslama had made one assumption that was about to prove fatal. He assumed his fleet would stay his fleet. It didn't. Maslama had pulled ships and crews from across the Caliphate. Egypt sent ships. Syria sent ships. North Africa sent ships. These weren't all Arab sailors. Many were Coptic Christians from Egypt, men who had been conquered, conscripted, and told to row toward a city they had no particular reason to want destroyed. They knew what Greek fire was. They had heard the stories from 674. And when the order came to sail into the harbour mouth, directly toward the Byzantine fireships waiting inside, some of them made a different choice. They defected. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Whole sections of the Egyptian contingent turned their ships around, or ran them aground, and surrendered to Byzantine forces on the shore. The Arab fleet's formation fractured at exactly the wrong moment, just as they were trying to execute the coordinated approach that was supposed to neutralize the fire. Maslama's counter-strategy required timing. It required his ships to move together, surround the Byzantine vessels simultaneously, close the distance before the tubes could be brought to bear. What it could not survive was gaps, holes in the line, ships that weren't where they were supposed to be. The Byzantine fireship captains saw the gaps. They didn't hesitate. The old captain of the lead fireship had been doing this for 20 years. He had scars on his hands and forearms from the one time the mechanism had misfired during a drill and the liquid had caught before it cleared the tube. He wore those scars the way other men wore medals. He was not a popular figure at court. He didn't attend the dinners where officers talked about honor and the proper conduct of war. He attended to his ship, his crew, and his weapon. His name isn't recorded, The sources just call him the captain of the lead dromon. When the Arab formation broke, he gave one order: ___, quote, _16______. The Byzantine line moved. The Arab response was exactly what Maslama had planned. The surrounding ships tried to close in, tried to cut off the Byzantine vessels before they could fire. And against an intact formation it might have worked. But the gaps left by the defecting Egyptians meant the flanking ships were too far away. They were rowing hard, trying to close the distance. They weren't going to make it. The lead fire ship reached the first Arab vessel, a large transport, riding heavy in the water, packed with troops meant to be landed inside the city. The bronze tube rotated, the bellows pushed. The liquid came out in a pressurized stream, caught, and the transport's side went up. Men on deck who hadn't understood what they were seeing, who had been told about Greek fire but had never seen it, they ran for the rail and jumped. And then they were in the water, and the fire was spreading across the water toward them, and the screaming started. The captain of the lead dromon didn't watch. He was already turning toward the next target. What happened over the next hours is hard to reconstruct precisely because the sources, both Byzantine and Arab, are clearly writing about chaos. Ships burning and drifting into other ships, crews jumping into water that was itself on fire in patches, Arab ships trying to reverse, getting tangled with ships behind them, blocking the retreat. The fire wasn't just a weapon, it was a disruptor. It broke formation, broke coordination, broke the plan. Maslama's counter-strategy required calm, disciplined execution. You cannot execute calmly when the ship next to yours is burning and men are screaming in the water around you. By the time the sun went down, a significant portion of the Arab fleet was gone. Not retreated, gone. Burned to the waterline or sunk. Maslama still had forces. He still had his land army on the peninsula. The siege wasn't over. He pulled back what remained of his fleet and reassessed. He sent a message to the Caliph: "Send more ships. Send more supplies. This will take longer than expected." The Caliph sent more ships. Over 1,000 additional vessels from Egypt and North Africa sailing to reinforce the siege. They ran into a storm in the Sea of Marmara. The storm destroyed most of them. The ones that survived limped into Maslama's harbour. His supply situation, already bad after the losses in the harbour battle, was now critical. His land army had been camped outside Constantinople through the summer. Now it was fall, and then winter. And the winter of 717 to 718 was brutal even by Byzantine standards. The Arab troops, many of them from warmer climates, were not equipped for it. Disease spread through the camp. Food ran short. Men died in numbers that the sources describe with a kind of stunned disbelief. And the Byzantine counterattacks kept coming. Leo had negotiated an alliance with the Bulgars to the north, another piece of the strategy that the honour and swords faction in his court had argued against, by the way, since making deals with pagans was also considered undignified. The Bulgar cavalry hit Maslama's land forces from behind, cutting supply lines further, forcing the Arab army to fight on multiple fronts while starving and sick. By spring, it was over. Maslama counted what he had left. He had come with the largest Arab military force ever assembled. He was leaving with a fraction of it. The land army broke camp and began the long march home. What remained of the fleet tried to follow by sea. The Byzantine fire ships were waiting for them at the exit. The final engagement finished what the first one had started. Arab sources say that of the original fleet, and remember, we are talking about over 1,000 ships before reinforcements, and then the reinforcements on top of that, the number that made it back to Arab-controlled ports was so small that later historians would spend years arguing about whether the figure could possibly be accurate. It was accurate. 1,800 ships lost. Some accounts say more. The Arab army that had looked like the end of the Byzantine Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Constantinople did not fall. Back inside the city, the celebrations lasted for days. Leo was declared a hero. Kallinikos, or rather, the tradition of engineering he had started, since Kallinikos himself was long dead by this point, was credited openly and publicly. The fire had saved them. The strategos who had wanted to fight sword to sword was at the celebration dinner. He sat at a table with the scarred captain of the lead dromon, who had been brought in specifically because Leo wanted him honoured in front of the whole court. The sources don't record exactly what was said between them, but one account mentions that the strategos raised his cup to the captain and said simply, quote, 17. The captain looked at him, quote, 18, quote, he said, quote, 19, quote. The strategos didn't argue. He had watched the battle from his position on the shore, commanding the conventional forces. He had seen the Arab formation break when the Egyptians defected. He had seen the fire ships go in through the gaps. He had seen what happened to the transports. And he understood something he hadn't before. The fire wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological force. It broke the enemy's ability to think clearly and execute plans. No amount of drilling could fully prepare a man for watching his ship burn in a way that water couldn't stop. He still didn't like it, but he understood it now, and understanding it was enough. The formula remained the Empire's most closely guarded secret. This part of the story is worth stopping on for a moment, because it tells you something about how seriously the Byzantines took this. The formula was held by the emperor personally. A small group of engineers knew parts of it, the proportions of certain ingredients, the heating process, the pressurization system. But no single person outside the emperor was supposed to know all of it. When engineers died, their knowledge died with them, unless they had been specifically authorized to pass it on. The formula was never written down in any form that survived, or if it was, those documents were destroyed so thoroughly that 1,500 years of historians have found nothing. Multiple emperors over the following centuries issued specific laws about Greek fire. The penalty for revealing the secret to a foreigner was death, not imprisonment, not exile, death. And not just for the person who revealed it, for their family. The Byzantines understood something that a lot of people in that era didn't fully grasp. The weapon was only a weapon as long as nobody else had it. The moment an enemy fleet showed up with their own Greek fire, the advantage disappeared. So the secret was the weapon as much as the liquid itself. Enemies tried to steal it, constantly. There's an account from the early 800s of an Arab agent who spent 3 years in Constantinople posing as a merchant, cultivating relationships with minor court officials, spending enormous amounts of money on bribes, working his way closer and closer to anyone who might have access to the formula or the engineers who worked with it. He got further than most. He actually managed to make contact with a low-level technician who worked in the workshops where the fire ships were maintained. The technician took his money, accepted his gifts, met with him several times, then reported him to the Imperial Guards. The Arab agent was arrested, tried, and executed. The technician received a reward and a commendation. The Emperor at the time made a point of publicizing the whole episode. Not the details of how the agent had operated, those were suppressed, but the fact that he had been caught and what had happened to him. It was a message. The secret was protected. Don't try. Others tried anyway. There's a story from around 813 that a Bulgarian Khan, not an Arab this time, but a Christian ruler who had his own conflicts with Byzantium, managed to capture several Byzantine fireships intact after a battle. The ships were his. The tubes were his. He had the mechanism. He did not have the liquid. His engineers tried to reconstruct it. They experimented for years. They got something that burned. They could not get something that burned on water. Without that property, it was just fire, and you could fight fire with water. It wasn't the same weapon. The Khan eventually gave up and sent an embassy to Constantinople to negotiate. The Byzantines were polite about it. The weapon was used in battle at least 5 major times over 4 centuries. Each time, the outcome was the same. The enemy came with superior numbers, and the fire changed the calculation completely. In 941, a fleet of over 1,000 ships from Rus, the ancestors of modern Russians and Ukrainians, based out of Kiev, sailed down toward Constantinople. The Rus were formidable fighters. They had been raiding Byzantine territory for decades and had learned hard lessons about Byzantine land armies. But they had never faced the fire at sea. The Byzantine fleet that came out to meet them was small, significantly outnumbered. The Rus commanders looked at the numbers and felt confident. Then the bronze tubes turned toward them. The accounts from Rus sources about what happened next are remarkable. Their chronicler writes about fire that fell from the sky, fire that could not be stopped, their men jumping into the sea to escape it and finding no escape there either. He writes about commanders weeping. He writes about an enemy weapon that seemed to come from God or from the devil, the Rus weren't sure which, and that no amount of courage could stand against. The fleet that had come to conquer Constantinople turned around and went home. Those who made it home. And this is the part that nobody who sneered at the fire ever wanted to address directly. These were not weak enemies. These were not poorly led enemies. These were serious military forces that had beaten serious armies in other contexts. The fire didn't work because the enemies were bad. It worked because the fire was an answer to a problem that courage and numbers couldn't solve. You cannot row a ship toward a bronze tube that sprays liquid fire. You can be brave. You can be disciplined. You can follow orders perfectly. And you will still be on a burning ship in a harbour full of burning water, and there is nothing your sword can do about it. 941. The Rus commanders had retreated. The few men who made it back gathered on the northern shore of the Bosphorus, stunned.
One officer, according to the Rus account, stood at the water's edge and watched the last of the burning ships go down. He had fought Byzantines before. He knew their infantry, their cavalry, their walls. He had a strategy for each of them. He had no strategy for this. 21 of his men asked. The officer thought for a moment. He said. They passed that advice on. The Rus came back later, but through negotiation, not invasion. They signed a trade treaty with Constantinople. They eventually converted to Christianity and built a deep relationship with Byzantium that shaped their entire civilization. None of that would have happened if the fire hadn't worked in 941. The strategos from 717, the one who had wanted to fight honorably, sword to sword, lived long enough to watch the aftermath of the siege's failure filter back in reports from Arab territories. He read accounts of Maslama's return, the silence that greeted him in Damascus, the caliph's reaction. The strategos asked a younger officer what he thought about all of it. The strategos said, the young officer was careful. He knew what the strategos had argued before the siege. The young officer thought about it. The strategos was quiet for a moment. Then, he never publicly reversed his position, but he never argued against the fire again either. And when younger officers came to him with complaints about the weapon, about its dishonorable nature, about how real soldiers fought with steel, he gave them a specific answer. He told them. None of them argued with him after that. The formula survived for roughly 400 years. Byzantine emperors used it selectively, carefully, always in situations where the empire was genuinely threatened. They didn't use it to expand. They used it to survive. And because they used it carefully, enemies never had enough exposure to it to fully counter it. Then the empire started falling apart. Not all at once, piece by piece. Political instability, crusaders who were theoretically allies but acted like enemies, economic collapse, territory lost. By the 12th century, Constantinople was a shadow of what it had been. By 1053, they had lost the main workshop where the fire was produced. Or rather, the engineers who knew how to produce it properly had died without passing on the complete formula. And what remained was partial knowledge, a weapon that worked somewhat, not the same thing. By the time the final siege came, not in the 7th century, not in the 8th, but much later, Greek fire was not what it had been. The formula had degraded through generations of incomplete transmission. Nobody alive could produce the original weapon. The city that had survived 5 impossible sieges because of a burning liquid that nobody could extinguish fell to a conventional army with conventional weapons. Better cannon, it turned out, could knock down even the strongest walls in the world. But that's a different story. The formula died with the empire. Historians have spent centuries trying to reconstruct it. Serious people with serious resources doing serious chemistry. They have found components that might have been in it. Quicklime, which reacts with water and produces heat. Naphtha, which is a naturally occurring petroleum product and burns intensely. Pine resin, possibly calcium phosphide, possibly other things. Various combinations have been tested.
Some of them produce fire that burns on water. Some of them are hard to extinguish with water. None of them have fully matched what the sources describe. The projection system, the distance, the specific behavior of the fire in water. Something in the original formula made it different from everything reconstructed since, and nobody knows what it was. The Byzantines were so good at keeping the secret that they kept it from the future as well. The scarred captain of the lead dromon retired after the siege of 717. He was given a small estate outside Constantinople, a title and a pension. He spent the rest of his life there, largely forgotten by the court that had honoured him at the victory dinner. He gave one recorded interview, if you can call it that. A visiting monk wrote down a conversation he had with the old captain toward the end of his life. The monk was writing a history and wanted to know about the siege. The old captain talked about the battle, the gaps in the Arab formation, the moment the lead ship fired, the burning transports, the screaming. At the end, the monk asked him, "Was it a dishonorable weapon?" There were those who said so. The captain looked at him. 32, he said. He paused. The monk wrote it down. He never published the account. It was found in a monastery archive 12 centuries later. The old captain was right about one thing. Constantinople was still standing. For another 700 years after that conversation, those walls held, and the empire kept going, and the eastern door of Europe stayed closed to forces that would have walked right through it. One weapon, one formula, one secret so tightly held that it went to the grave with the civilization that built it. They called it dishonorable. They called it devil's fire. They called it a coward's trick. The men who called it those things are forgotten. The weapon they sneered at held a city for 4 centuries. And the formula, the thing that made it all work, nobody has ever cracked it. 1,500 years of trying. Some secrets don't give themselves up.